Still Snoop Dogg and D.I.
Hello and welcome everybody. I'm Chris Notaro. This is Villanova Tip Time. Today is Sunday, November 28th, and it is the end of a long holiday Thanksgiving weekend where for the first time in a number of years we haven't had any Cats action over this Thanksgiving holiday. And frankly, I don't know about the rest of you, but I certainly missed it on Thursday, dining over turkey, not having a Cats Thanksgiving game. Heard mixed reviews. Some people like it, some people don't. But we haven't seen you since last Sunday when the Cats fell to Purdue in the championship game of the Hall of Fame tip-off. We'll get into that in a little bit. We are here to break down the Cats heading into their first Big 5 game of the season against the Salle Explorers. We'll also get into that a little bit later as well. But as first and like always, we're going to go around the horn at the top of college basketball. What's been going on in a very juicy week, feast week as they call it, Thanksgiving week. Lots of tournaments going on all around, not only the country but internationally, going out to places like Atlantis, etc. And we've seen a lot of action. We've seen a lot of familiar names. We've seen a lot of upsets across the top 25. A lot of really amazing games. And I think something I'll probably touch on again at some point later on in the conversation as we gear up for the Cats to tip off at the top of the hour on ESPN2 against LaSalle. But something I'll probably say again is for the first, it feels like for probably more so than any year in recent memory, we've had a glimpse into so many sort of late March, even April caliber games in the first 2 weeks. And this is not just limited to the Villanova Nation. This is across the whole sphere of college basketball. So we'll get into some of the big ones that we saw this week. We'll talk about what's happening around the top of the Big East. We'll pick up where we left off, Nova, in what was, a tough loss in the end to a really, really good Purdue team. We'll introduce you to the LaSalle Explorers for our first Big 5 game tonight. We'll talk about keys to the game, and then we'll wrap up, hopefully with a few minutes for y'all to top off your beverages and ward off the Sunday scaries here with a nice little Big 5 Cats game at the Palestra heading into your week. So I think the first sort of noteworthy game from the week was Gonzaga played UCLA in a 1-2 matchup on Tuesday in a game that was really, for all intents and purposes, a letdown. It was never really a game. Gonzaga crushed UCLA by 20 in that game. They were up 20 at halftime, and they mostly cruised in the second half. Another one of the early in the week surprises was Wisconsin, who had looked rough at times in some of their early games of the season. Mind you, they had lost to Providence at home in the Big East Big Ten Challenge just last week. They were able to win the Maui Invitational Tournament, including a win over Houston, who is currently a bracketology 2 seed. So the Badgers kind of picking up strong for the Big Ten after the Big Ten had a really tough last week, which we talked about on the show last week. Number 10, Alabama was stunned on Thanksgiving against Iona and Rick Pitino's team, but really, really surprising loss there. And then Friday, we had probably multiple entries into the battling it out for game of the week. I think the one that wins out is going to be number 5, Duke, taking down number 1, Gonzaga, 84-81 in Las Vegas in what was a totally just an awesome, awesome game. Yet another example, again, of that sort of late March, potentially Final Four caliber preview. So we've just had so many of these in the first 2 weeks of the season. This game was sort of back and forth. Duke, it felt like in the first half, Duke played their absolute perfect game, yet somehow only went into halftime with, I think, a 3-point lead. Paolo Banchero was out of his mind in the first half. It was 20 points. They were talking about him maybe being the first freshman to, put up 40 against a number 1 team in the land, and that just wasn't to be, as he was hampered largely, I think, by cramping issues in the second half. Only was able to notch another point. In the end, Gonzaga was, Gonzaga looked continued to look the part of this number one, but number 5 Duke was able to really answer the call and took down Gonzaga, which I think was tough for most Villanova fans I was talking to, as far as who do you root for in this game? Do you root for Duke? Do you root for Gonzaga? If Gonzaga gets past Duke in this game, they sort of have that clear path to another undefeated season, although their conference does look a little bit better than it was last year, right? So it's not just a guarantee that they go completely undefeated, but this just felt like the best chance to take them down and to unseat them in that number one spot, and Duke was able to do it. So kudos to Duke, I suppose. Although the Coach K victory lap, the Coach K farewell tour, which was already in full effect, is only going to get that much louder with such a huge win that is probably going to vault them to the number one spot. They're between Duke and Purdue. They're going to be number 1 and 2. I think you can make an argument for either one of them to be at number 1. And for the other to be at number 2. I think because Duke unseated the number 1 team, I personally would favor Duke there. I think it looks obviously a little bit better on Nova if one of their losses is to the team that now holds the number 1 ranking. At the end of the day, I don't think it matters a whole lot with these November games what the rankings are. It's all just kind of fodder, but the optics are at least interesting to follow. The other game on the national stage that was definitely worth paying attention to, and I highly recommend you go back and watch the clip if you didn't see it, was Dayton beating number 4 Kansas on Friday with a floating buzzer beater. Dickie V was on the call. He had been on the call earlier in the week in the Gonzaga UCLA game. Good to see him, legendary sportscaster. He's been battling cancer. Really nice to see him on the call for that big Gonzaga UCLA game. Also on the call for this Dayton-Kansas game on Friday, Dayton hits this ridiculous floating buzzer beater that just sort of bounced, it was just like bounced a million times on the rim, goes down, and they beat Kansas. Stunning in its own right, all the more stunning considering Dayton had lost a quote-unquote bye game just a few days prior. For those of you unfamiliar, the bye game is the term for when they have a much smaller school come in, and basically it's like a tune-up powder puff game, and Dayton lost that game. So for them to beat number 4 Kansas just a few days later in such a sort of a dynamic fashion, really awesome game to watch, and really just again a clip to go find if you haven't seen it. So what's happening with the Big East throughout this week? I think the game of the week for the Big East was, besides, of course, Villanova-Purdue on Sunday, which we'll get into in a moment, was number 22 UConn over number 19 Auburn on Wednesday, 115-109 in double overtime in the Battle for Atlantis tournament, in an absolute thriller. This was being sort of called the game of the young season, although it's been funny, you've seen that label being thrown around a lot in just the 3 weeks of basketball we've had so far. So again, just goes to show you that we've been just a little bit spoiled with the quality of play we've had, and I'm not going to complain about that. So UConn over Auburn, although they did end up losing to Michigan State the next day on Thanksgiving. Both Xavier and Seton Hall, after strong starts to their season, came into the week with fresh appearances in the top 25 overall rankings, although both teams did take losses this week. Xavier's loss was to Iowa State, which doesn't actually end up looking so bad after Iowa State turned around after that game, and also later in the week dumped number 9 Memphis by 20, and will almost certainly be ranked next week. So if you're following that mental math, Iowa State beats Xavier, then beats number 9 Memphis. Iowa State's, I think, 6-0, for sure going to be ranked next week coming up. So Xavier, I think, was ranked 25 coming into the week, will almost certainly drop out by virtue of that loss, but it's not necessarily a terrible loss. When you look around the Big East as a whole, I think there aren't a ton of there aren't a ton of huge standout surprises yet. I would say the big surprises to me are, number one, the only undefeated remaining team is DePaul, which needs to be stated. I think the strength of schedule isn't necessarily amazing for DePaul, but that said, it's also not like complete trash powder puff that it might have been in previous years. They do have some talent on their team. DePaul might not be like the bottom basement team in the league that they've been in years past. They do have some real talent on their roster, and they did just have another player with questionable. There were some eligibility questions get approved. So DePaul, sort of the last undefeated team now, I believe it's 6-0 a few weeks into the season. Probably didn't have that on your bingo cards. And then Marquette, also a surprise. The Shaka Smart era off to a nice start. But otherwise, you have the Xaviers, the Seton Halls, and then most importantly, like I've talked about, UConn really as sort of that seeming like that primary challengers to Villanova at the top of the league. Oh boy. So let's catch our breath here and talk about where we last left Villanova at the Purdue game last Sunday. I think the first thing I want to start with for sure is the good part, which is this team is good. This Villanova team is good. Our only 2 losses are against 2 of the absolute best teams in the country in UCLA and Purdue, both in games that we kind of should have won, held leads late, sizable leads late. Gillespie, Moore, Samuels, and Slater is a good enough, we'll call it a backcourt plus, to make it to New Orleans. We've talked about this before. I think this has already been proven, not only through the dominating win last week against Tennessee, but again in holding a late lead over Purdue in a game that they really should have won. You hate to lose that game late, but at the end of the day, it's like, okay, this team has the talent, has the ability to execute, has the ability to be there. So the good news is this team is good. The 2 bubbling narratives that this team already knows it's going to need to answer for, and we've talked a lot about, but are going to continue to bubble up and almost get stronger, especially coming out of this Purdue game, because they were both huge problems in this game, are 1, lack of size, and 2, lack of depth. So the lack of size really, really hurt us in this game. We just felt like we were just getting crushed on the boards. It also felt like for a time, especially in the first half, it felt like, it was like one of those things where like everything felt like it was going against us. Like we weren't getting the bounces. Just one of those situations where you really just have to full on, like, quote unquote attitude your way through it. And I would say the team did a good job of doing that and persevering through it, but the lack of size was absolutely palpable. And also, I would say after Eric Dixon has been an absolutely pleasant surprise to the start of this Villanova season and had stepped up huge, this was the first time that he really had started to look a little bit shaky, had started to almost be a little bit more of a liability in this game. Seemed like, I don't want to say lack of focus because that sounds accusatory, and it seems like these guys never lack focus per se, but it just didn't seem like he had his A game, and it was not the night to not have his A game when the lack of size was already going to be a problem, and he was our size guy. I think the other component is the lack of depth, a big hullabaloo if you follow all the different contributors in the Villanova content universe. Two divided camps of the freshmen need to play more to give the primary 6 guys just a little bit of rest, because it was clear in this game that they ran out of gas down the stretch. It looked like that was the case against UCLA as well. But there's also a clear lack of trust for Coach Wright with the freshmen in some of these situations. So it's going to be interesting to see that unfold, especially as we'll get into the upcoming schedule in a moment. There aren't really any like breather stretches in this schedule. So this lack of depth is not something that's just going to work itself out naturally with some powder puff games. And if it does, that might actually be this week with the games that we have coming up imminently, which we'll talk about in a second. I think other reflections on Purdue is that, blowing these light leads just hurts. We've now done it twice in the big spots with UCLA and Purdue. So it hurt extra just to sort of be going through a deja vu a week later. And in both cases, bad free throw misses were a huge contributor. Which is super frustrating because usually that's just something that's automatic for these Villanova teams is high free throw shooting percentage. But I think we were 9 for 17 in this game, so that was the difference in the game, right? You hit some of those free throws. It's not just about the points; it's about the momentum in the game at the time. I think that was really just you can't really blame it on any one thing. But man, it just felt so huge in both of these losses, but particularly down the stretch against Purdue as it was sort of slipping away. I think to round out the Purdue conversation, while we say there are no moral victories, the objective college basketball observatory was calling this a Final Four caliber game after the game was done. And we can say again that Nova loses this kind of game in November to win it in March or April. So the takeaway for Nova Nation has to be that we're seeing what we need to see out of this team. This team can get there at the end of the year. But we know we have some size limitations to make up for, and now we need to see who else we can go to at the end of the bench to increase the depth problem and to create a little bit fresher burn at the end of the game. Because it looks like, Brian Anton, who many of us expected to be in the rotation, it looks like he's not super close to coming back. So we need to figure out where that's going to come from, because right now this sort of like 6.5 man rotation might not be enough once we're playing sort of that upper echelon caliber of team. And guess what? We're going to have another crack at it in a couple weeks with number 6 Baylor on the schedule a few weeks out, fresh off their winning the Battle for Atlantis tournament just this past weekend. So if you look ahead to this next stretch of schedule, you have Big Five and other non-conference. You also have an early start to the Big East schedule, as that has been starting, I believe, last year. You have the conference schedule sort of starting earlier than normal as well. So you're going to have the conference schedule starting before the Big Five schedule is even wrapped up. So you sort of have a wacky schedule year, including this sort of loaded non-conference slate. So you've got LaSalle tonight. You've got Penn this week. You've got the Holy War next week, next Saturday at home against the St. Joe's team, who, always a passionate game, although you hope that really isn't a game just because the calibers of the teams are not close. You have Syracuse at the Garden, but Syracuse might not be very good. In fact, they probably aren't. Then after that, you have that rematch, that Sweet 16 rematch with number 6 Baylor, who's likely to jump up into the top 5 national ranking. Even though they lost some guys, they're fresh off the national championship, right? Beat us in the Sweet 16 when we did not have Colin Gillespie. So this is going to be a high-energy game for our guys. So got that one circled on the calendar. Also, we do have the ranked win against Tennessee, but having dropped against UCLA and Purdue, really want to make sure you get one of these sort of games against the biggest of the boppers. So Baylor is going to be the last really big opportunity to do that. And then after Baylor, we start conference play with games at Creighton and home against Xavier before Christmas. And like I said, you're interweaving the remainder of Big Five play in before the end of the year. So as Coach Wright has said, this is our toughest non-conference schedule in a while. He felt he owed it to these senior leaders. But one challenge they're going to have is, needing to focus on sort of gaining a rhythm, which is tough. Because you look at this schedule, and even though some of these teams present great mismatches, like this week in particular, Villanova is the biggest game on these teams' schedule, and we saw how that went against an opponent like Howard that shot the lights out. Now that's not going to happen every time, but it also means that the team can't afford to take any nights off because it's anything can happen. Mayhem can happen. Long and the short of it is, I think the team needs to focus on gaining a little bit of a rhythm now with the sort of the really heavy schedule of the last 2 weeks behind them. And LaSalle and Penn are going to offer a chance this week to do just that. So just to now introduce LaSalle a little bit, now we're coming down to the wire here. We got about 6 minutes till game time. LaSalle's team, you're going to be highlighted by former Louisville guard Josh Nickelberry, who came over in the transfer portal. You're also going to have Jameer Brickus and Jack Clark also averaging double figures in points. One thing to note about this LaSalle team is they turn the ball over a lot. So, and they don't necessarily, they're not a heavy, they're not a tremendous scoring threat of a team. So even though LaSalle hasn't beaten Villanova in almost a decade, and the last time they beat Nova was a notable down year for Coach Wright in, I think, 2012, this is going to be a very tough year for them to break that streak, and tonight's game is a mismatch in just about every way imaginable. So again, you look for Villanova to really exploit the weaknesses. You exploit a team that traditionally turns the ball over a lot, is not big, does not play big, and is not a tremendous scoring team. So Villanova can kind of capitalize on a lot of these mismatches on really both sides of the court. And you expect tonight's game not to necessarily be a super stressful one for the Nova Nation. However, you also have to remember what I just said a moment ago. Villanova's heavily favored tonight by around 19 points. So coach is probably going to have the guys' game faces on, knowing that there are no nights off and that this is the biggest game on LaSalle's schedule. One thing we actually haven't talked about yet, which is probably shame on me for bearing the lead, the big story over the last 48 hours has been that the Villanova team, has been sort of hit by a little bit of a flu bug this week. So one of the more interesting stories to come out of that is Demir Cosby-Roundtree, who many of us thought, including the program, thought his career as a player at Villanova was done, is actually going to be dressing tonight for the team. He's on the active roster tonight because of issues with this flu bug. So we don't know as of us starting on the stream. I don't yet know what the final starting five looked like. It looked like coach was relatively mum about who was going to be out, besides freshman Jordan Longino, who is going to be out of tonight's game, battling this flu bug that was going around the team. Sounds like it had gone through a bunch of guys, but coach was relatively mum on who, because it sounds like everybody else had been cleared to play, but it's unclear what that's going to do to the rotation tonight. And I think no matter what, because of the clear mismatch issues just on both ends of the floor, tonight is going to be a really good opportunity to expand that rotation, to get more run for the younger guys. And that, I think, is going to be exciting for many of us Cats fans who worry that, of course, that depth and that rotation may have cost us a couple of those signature wins against the top teams earlier in the year. Looking for both Eric Dixon and Jermaine Samuels to have bounce back games, like we talked about a little bit earlier. Eric Dixon's had an amazing start to the year. He's been a very pleasant surprise, but had a really rough game against Purdue. Sort of looked kind of outmanned and outgunned for the first time. So look for him to have a bounce back game down low, especially as LaSalle isn't big and doesn't play big. And then same goes for Jermaine Samuels, who had a terrible shooting day against Purdue, including going 1 for 8 from 3. You like a senior leader like Jermaine to utilize an advantageous matchup for a nice bounce back game tonight. The other player I want to call out is Caleb Daniels, because it looked awesome. He looked awesome against Purdue, scoring 17 off the bench. He and Justin Moore were sort of our players of the game there. It was awesome to see, considering he's suffered some effects from long COVID, including some minor cardiac complications. So it's had a clear statistical impact on him. So it's hard not to root for a guy like this who's clearly working very hard to fight through this. And it's really nice to see him have a game like that against Purdue, which is something he can hopefully build on to like start a little bit of a momentum train here. And I want to see him sort of build on that tonight against, again, sort of an advantageous matchup where, the rotations will be mixing and matching, and hopefully he'll get plenty of looks. And then finally, you have Gillespie, Moore, and Slater, who have all sort of become our steady eddies. You expect 2 out of those 3, if not all 3 of them, to have big games against less strong opponents. It'll be interesting to see who sort of kind of steps away from the pack. I think everybody's going to get a chance to eat tonight, so it'll be interesting to see who indeed steps up. One point of note is whether or not Slater can keep up this ridiculous shooting pace. He's shooting in the high 50s percentage from 3 with an opponent like LaSalle. No disrespect to them. It'll be interesting to see if he can keep that pace up, because it is likely that he'll be getting the looks to continue that if he can knock them down. So it's about that time to let you go refresh your beverage, catch a bio break, find your favorite viewing spot. You won't see me again until the Baylor game on Sunday the 12th. My wife and I are actually bringing our son to Hawaii on Friday. We're going to a conference for my wife. I'm going to a doctor conference out there. So you won't be seeing me until the Baylor game on the 12th. I'm going to be sad to miss you all. I'm going to be sad to miss the Holy War. I'm going to be sad to miss doing a tip time for the Holy War. But I'll catch you on the 12th for the Baylor game. But for now, get your TVs ready to flip over to ESPN2, because, ladies and gentlemen, it's tip time.